Good morning, everybody, and welcome to another webinar presented by Fluxmans and hosted by the Mail and Guardian. I, for those of you who don't know me, am Ira Epstein, the Joint CEO and Managing Director of Fluxmans. We are a dynamic law firm. We offer an extensive range of services to a diverse client base. Our passion, knowledge, and understanding within our service offering, as well as our ability to simplify complexities, ensures that our clients receive the best personal service, support, and solutions to their varied legal matters. This morning, I have joining me, firstly, Bronwyn Marks. Bronwyn is acknowledged by her peers, employers, and employees as a highly experienced and competent specialist in the employment law field. She appears before the CCMA and other bargaining councils, primarily on behalf of employers, defending all types of claims for unfair employment practices, dismissals, and retrenchments. Bronwyn is a co-director of mine. She heads up our training program and is also our COVID compliance officer. Welcome, Bronwyn.
Thanks, Ira.
And then we also have Dani Pretorius. Dani is also a director of Fluxmans. He sits with me on our executive committee and heads up our employment law department. He is a unique combination of a highly reputable employment lawyer and a greatly experienced commercial litigator. Dani has acted as a judge in the Labour Court, and Chambers and Partners acknowledge him as an experienced practitioner who maintains his standing in the market with a particularly notable reputation for his handling of employment and employment law disputes. Dani, welcome, and thank you for being here with us today.
Hi, Ira.
Okay, as most of you are aware of the format, you can ask questions throughout the webinar by making use of the chat space. We'll try and answer as many of the questions as we can, time permitting. In addition, the webinar is being recorded, and if you want to, you'll be able to get a copy of the recording. Tomorrow, all those who have registered will be sent a link, and you'll be able to download it. If you didn't register or you want somebody else to be able to download it, you can just send a request to rberry, R-B-E-R-R-Y, @fluxmans.com, and Renelle, who is in charge of our marketing, will then oblige you and send you a copy of the recording. Okay, the main focus of this webinar this morning is going to be the vexed question of mandatory vaccination policies. Can an enterprise lawfully implement such a policy? And we will deal with certain matters that are ancillary there too. So on the 11th of June this year, the Minister of Employment and Labour issued what is known as the Consolidated Direction on Occupational Health and Safety Measures in certain workplaces. And throughout this webinar, we're going to refer to that as the direction. The direction is aimed at protecting the health and safety of employers and employees, as well as workers and clients at the workplace during the pandemic. And it has stopped the hotly debated issue as to whether or not an employer may implement a mandatory vaccination policy in the workplace. However, when implementing such a workplace vaccination policy, employers need to ensure that the rights of employees to bodily integrity and religious freedom and beliefs are taken into account. It also encourages the implementation of mandatory vaccination policies that are based on mutual respect, which achieves a balance between public health imperatives, the constitutional rights of employees, and the efficient operation of an employer's business. So, Bronwyn, perhaps you can assist here and answer a couple of questions for me. From when are mandatory vaccinations allowed?
So, the directions made it very clear that employers may implement a mandatory vaccination policy with following a risk assessment, which includes indicates an operational requirement for the policy. They've also made it very clear that governments made it clear that they won't be implementing a compulsory mandatory vaccination program, and that vaccinations will only be administered by consent. So following the direction, an employer was required to perform the risk assessment and indicate within 21 days from the implementation of the direction whether or not they intended to implement the mandatory vaccination policy.
Donnie, what's your view? Why should an employer consider a vaccination policy?
Ira, firstly, it would give guidance as to the need for mandatory vaccinations, and it would be informative, and it would regularize the manner in which the employer intends going about this.
So what happens if an employee simply refuses to be inoculated without a reasonable justification? What can I do if I've now gone and put in a mandatory policy? What remedy do I have?
Well, the direction sets out that you would have to counsel such an employee. It would probably require some form of consultation to understand the basis for the refusal. You would have to allow the employee to seek guidance from his trade union or other advisors, and if it is a medical issue, to also seek medical advice before you impose the requirement of vaccination upon such an employee.
So, Bronwyn, what kind of grounds could an employee rely on in refusing to take part in a mandatory vaccination program that would probably hold water?
So, Ira, in terms of the direction, government set out a few objections. The grounds for objections to having the vaccine could be based broadly on the Constitution, on constitutional grounds, religious or cultural beliefs, or any medical or health concerns. So mandatory, yeah.
No, so you mentioned three there. I just want to ask you a question about the one. You talk about constitutional grounds. Can you or Donnie just give me an idea of what grounds there are in the Constitution that could assist me as an employee for refusing to be vaccinated?
Well, there's the rights to bodily integrity and the rights to belief and opinion and religious beliefs that they are expressly referred to in the direction as what have to be taken into account and the objections upon which an employee can rely for not wanting to participate in a mandatory vaccination process.
Okay, and those would be open then, I suppose, to everybody. Any employee could raise those grounds or not.
Yes, look, your reliance on the Constitution of the Republic of South Africa cannot be limited.
Okay, Bronwyn, following this direction, what was an employer required to do? What should we have done as an employer once this direction came out?
So, like I mentioned briefly earlier, an employer was required to undertake a risk assessment of their particular workplace, because obviously each person's workplace would be different. And if it was found that from an operational perspective, it would be necessary to implement a mandatory vaccination policy, advise their employees that they were intending to implement the mandatory vaccination policy and update their workplace plan.
So I've got two questions for you. When this direction came out, we at Fluxman's, with your assistance as our COVID compliance officer, we told our staff that we were not going to adopt a mandatory vaccination policy. We did encourage it. We also told staff that we would give them time off. They wouldn't have to take unpaid leave or leave on the day that they chose to go, the days that they chose to get vaccinated. But now it's a different world out there. It seems that the rest of the world are taking a little bit of a different approach. There are a number of corporates who have come out in favor of vaccination policies, etc. Could we, if we chose to change our mind, could we now come out with another policy and say, never mind what we told you when the direction came out, we now require certain members of our staff to be vaccinated? Are we allowed to do that, Donnie?
Ira, first and foremost, the direction that was issued in its own wording says it's a mere guideline. our courts have held that directions or codes of good practice do not constitute binding law. It also says in there that it is really a yardstick to be used by anyone evaluating the conduct of an employer in effecting mandatory vaccinations, whether it conducted itself in a fair manner. So I cannot see that there's any basis to say that if you had missed the 21 days that were set out in the direction, that you cannot change your mind or decide that you now need to have a vaccination policy. As I say, it's not strict law, it's a pure guideline.
Okay, so I can change my mind, and for those employers who fail to meet that 21-day time frame, they've still got the opportunity to go and put out a notice as to whether they intend to do it or not. And even if they do, there's no recourse because it's not really binding, as you put it. Donnie, does the implementation of a mandatory workplace vaccination policy constitute a unilateral change to the terms and conditions of employment?
It's a difficult question, Ira, because terms and conditions of employment relate mostly to issues such as hours of work, place of work, salary, benefits, those types of things. And it appears to me that the entitlement to have worked at home did not in itself constitute a term and condition of employment, but was a concession made in the circumstances in which we find ourselves. So if you say to people, we now want to vaccinate you, I don't believe that that can be equated to a term and condition of employment. But having said that, even if I'm wrong on this, an employer in our country is entitled to unilaterally change terms and conditions of employment as long as he had consulted upon it, and the employee's remedy against such a unilateral term and variation to terms would be to strike. So if you're not mobilized and organized with union involvement, the strike remedy is rendered quite nugatory because people do not want to go stand by themselves on the corner with a placard. It's usually the unions that whip up strike action. So it's not really a remedy that I would suspect, unless it is in an environment where the unions are very strong, that people would be able to claim some form of relief on a unilateral variation. The only other remedy that you may possibly have is the remedy of a constructive dismissal, but I doubt that would work because this requirement the requirement of mandatory vaccination would not be something that renders your employment intolerable in and of itself.
It's a really interesting question. It's quite amusing. And it sort of puts it in the opposite, throws an opposite light on the topic. And that is not what can you do to your employees who don't want to be vaccinated, but are you allowed to give incentives to motivate your employees to be vaccinated? So, for example, would I be able to offer a cash incentive or certain other incentives to employees on the grounds that you qualify only if you vaccinate? Would that be lawful? Could I do that?
As long as it's not discriminatory on the basis of one of the outlawed grounds of discrimination, race, color, sex, religion, those types of things, you can have such incentives. You would probably find that the person who objects on religious grounds will say, but then it is discriminatory. But the government itself is considering incentives as programs to try and nudge people in the direction of being vaccinated. So I don't believe that it would be discriminatory.
I suppose it would also depend on the incentive, Donnie. I presume one couldn't say only those who get vaccinated are going to get raises or increases.
Now that might be problematic.
Yeah, so one would have to look carefully at the incentive that's being offered. The day off or a day afterwards to recover, something like that may work, but I suppose one would have to be careful.
Or perhaps only vaccinated employees can use the lifts.
Or the canteen or something like that.
Yes, okay. It's like those ships that are now sailing from the Caribbean. I was reading, they've got those stories about if you're vaccinated, then you're entitled to go and have the full run of the ship. If you haven't been vaccinated, you are located in steerage and you can go to maybe one restaurant and one little area on deck to have a smoke. But for the rest of the ship, you can't have access to it. Why people would want to do that, I don't know. Bronwyn, what considerations should an employer contemplate when determining whether to implement a mandatory vaccination policy or not? I mean, it's not something that one just does lightly. What do you take into account in coming to this decision? What are the factors you look at?
There would obviously be various factors, but the ones that I can think of would be the viability of remote working, continued remote working, and the effectiveness of social distancing in the particular workplace, the number of employees required to travel for work purposes, how many vulnerable employees you would have in the workplace, temporary alternative placements for employees who are vulnerable or would have a higher risk if they had to contract COVID-19, number of employees who are regularly exposed to the public. For example, in labor, we go to the CCMA and public places often. The rate of infections or fatalities that you had in the workplace, the number of employees who have religious, cultural, or medical objections, because you would know that through the counseling, the consultations you would have had with them before implementing the policy, the effectiveness of imposing less stringent means to get the same result, and any collective agreement in the workplace that deals with this, with inoculations and mandatory vaccination policies.
So, for example, at the moment, we at Fluxman's, we've got part of our program and our COVID policies is that if you travel, either local or international, before you can come back to work, you need to go and isolate for a period of 10 to 14 days before we let you back into the workplace. We could, you're saying, as part of these considerations, determine that anybody who's flying needs to be vaccinated. Could we do that? We could select them as a group of people, because I understand that you don't have to, your policy doesn't have to be for the entire workplace. You can select various groups or groupings who you can have a mandatory policy for, namely those maybe who interact with the public more often or those who are more likely to bring it into the workplace. So in our case, those that go to the CCMA, like the Labour Department, those who travel who are flying, we could impose a policy on those select group of peoples. They cannot come to our office unless they're vaccinated. Is that correct?
Yes.
Yes.
The direction is quite clear that you can differentiate between the risk that you may face through a certain grouping of people. You will have noticed from recent publications that most of the airlines have insisted on their public-facing staff all to be vaccinated. And I see there's an airline today that fired their one crew who refused to be vaccinated. So, yes, I think people who work with the public or in confined spaces such as aircraft, you can insist that they be vaccinated.
An obvious example is also vulnerable employees. In terms of the direction, an employer can ask employees to disclose their health status, and obviously people who have comorbidities or are at higher risk should they contract COVID-19 could be part of the individuals which would be part of the vaccination policy and required to go for a vaccine.
Bronwyn, can I as an employee refuse to make that public? Can I refuse to tell you what my vaccination status is?
So the direction asks the employees to disclose it, but I don't think that you would ever be able to force an employee to disclose their health status if they don't want to. But then the obligation is not on the employer anymore, because how can you protect employees who don't disclose their health status?
It does, though, create a concern for the rest of my employees, though, because if I've got employees who are working together with or in close proximity to other employees, and I need to be concerned about the health of all my employees, and I've got some who are refusing to disclose their status, I'm not sure where that leaves me as an employer, because I don't know then how to protect the other people, other than to suggest that if you're refusing to tell me, then clearly you haven't been vaccinated. I must make that my assumption and come up with a mandatory policy around that, perhaps.
Yes, and
Absolutely correct.
To come out of the woodwork, and it's going to be an interesting minefield.
It looks like it. On what grounds can an employee object to being vaccinated, Bronwyn? What would be reasonable grounds?
So we've touched on this previously. There's broadly two categories, and those are also listed in the guideline to the direction. And it's medical objections and safety concerns. So, for example, if there's a contraindication that you shouldn't have the vaccine, religious, cultural, or constitutional objections as well. And that then, Dani mentioned, it's the right to bodily integrity, freedom of religion, belief, and opinion.
So we spoke earlier about the fact that I can ask employees to disclose their vaccination status. I suppose I could do that in the form of a survey, or I could do that one-on-one.
Yes, the advice that has been sought from me is exactly this. How do you go about that, and would that infringe any law? Now, there is the Employment Equity Act that says that medical testing is prohibited, but that I do not believe goes as far as suggesting that you cannot ask the status in a pandemic as we are in now. But even if you do not want to raise the ire of some militant employee, I would suggest that you say, some kind of memo, please provide me for risk assessment purposes with your COVID-19 status. Have you been vaccinated? Yes, no. Have you had COVID-19? Yes, no. And then you will have to work out from that what you can accept. And if someone says he refuses to tell you, I think, as you said earlier, you can assume that the person has not been vaccinated.
So there's some interesting questions coming through, Dani. There's one here which says, what if you've got a group of employees who refuse to work with other employees who are refusing to be vaccinated? What do you do with those who won't work?
Well, Ira, it is this very difficult balancing act where you have this requirement to provide a safe working environment. And if some employees indicate that they won't work because they are scared of catching COVID, it would, for me, require at least an interrogation of their reasons. And if there's something to it, you may then be forced into considering a mandatory vaccination policy. Look, people don't work, they don't get paid, because in our law you have to tender your services, and if you don't tender your services, you don't get paid. But it's also no good for an employer who has a group of people who's not tendering their services, because whatever their output would have been, they don't have now.
Okay, thank you. What does an employer do if the employee refuses to be vaccinated, despite your implementation of a mandatory vaccination policy, and that refusal makes it impossible for the employee to perform his or her role, Dani?
Ira, the employer would have to go through the process of understanding firstly why there is this refusal, and then if it is a justified refusal, attempt to find a reasonable accommodation for the employee. Now, the reasonable accommodation is not a new topic, a new term in our law. It's applied in any event, in any incapacity termination or discussion where someone has gotten ill, cannot work anymore. It's the reasonable accommodation principle. So you would have to see if you can have this person work from home, work at night, wear far more extreme PPE. And if all of those things is not practical, then you would be faced at the end of the day in a termination on various grounds: retrenchment, incapacity, and if it's a person who just unreasonably refuses with no justifiable basis, it may even be misconduct in the form of refusing to obey a reasonable instruction.
Okay. We've got another question here. If an enterprise or a company has a mandatory vaccination policy, are they obliged to cover the costs of all the vaccinations, historic and those going forward after their policy? And would they have to pay for any medical implication that followed post vaccination? So if you're going to force me to adopt a policy, are you going to do you have to, or are you obliged to then pay for the vaccination? And if I get sick as a result of your forcing me to have this vaccination in terms of your policy, are you going to be obliged to pay the costs of my medical treatment?
Bronwyn?
So I was going to say the direction doesn't provide for employers to pay for the vaccinations. And at the moment, I think that the government is covering the cost of vaccinations. And I think it's important to also state that employees can never be forced to take the vaccine. So there has to be consent. So if they have taken the vaccine, we must assume that it was done by consent, regardless of the mandatory vaccination policy. And I think it would be a very far leap to then hold the employer responsible or liable for any adverse reaction that you may have to the vaccine.
Ara, one must remember there's a distinction between an involuntary vaccination and a mandatory vaccination, because in a mandatory vaccination, you can choose not to do it. There may be consequences to your choice, but you still agree to the vaccination in a mandatory vaccination program. It's not as if people are going to be held down and jabbed. And I think if that was the case, then you would probably pick up the liability if something then goes wrong. But I'm not sure you can ever pick up the liability where someone chooses to be vaccinated.
Okay, there's another question here. When recruiting new employees, we're taking on new guys now, we're interviewing for a position. Can we ask at that interview what the person's vaccination status is? And can we refuse to employ, or what would amount potentially to discriminate against candidates who are not vaccinated and prefer perhaps employing those who are vaccinated?
I see little difficulty in making it a condition of employment that you going forward would only want vaccinated employees. The whole question of what you can and cannot ask and say at the interview stage is quite tricky. But I would suspect you could put that in the brochure or the questionnaire that you ask people to fill in when they apply for employment. I would be concerned that anyone who does an interview starts asking about medical conditions, because you may walk into the nightmare of disclosure of personal information that you may not have been able to get otherwise.
Okay. What's also very interesting is that we are not going to express a view on any medical grounds over here. We're not doctors, we're not virologists. And there's a lot of different studies coming out at the moment. There are those pro-vaccine, there are those anti-vaccine, and we're not in a position to determine what's correct and what's not, and to express a view on what the consequences of this all are. But there was a very, very interesting interview with Todd Zwicky from the George Mason University, where he's a professor of law, Bronwyn. I understand that they implemented a mandatory vaccination program, and he took them on because he refused to vaccinate. And if I remember correctly, what he did was he raised as a defense the fact that he had recently had COVID, and that his natural immunity was that much stronger than that of someone who had been vaccinated, that it lasted longer, etc. And he simply refused. And I think that it was upheld over there that that was a justifiable ground and the university could not force him to be vaccinated. That was an exception, an exemption from their vaccination program, namely him and I presume others who had received COVID and still had the antibodies. And on that grounds, he was then excused from the mandatory vaccination program of the university. Would that hold water here as well, perhaps?
Well, all these things will be tested, I have no doubt, in due course, but I'm sure that employees will raise that as a justification. And an employer will then have to look into the argument and potentially send the employee for further medical evaluation to see if they do have antibodies and the level of antibodies, for example, and then would have to make a call once they have all the relevant information. But it may very well be a justifiable ground. All this new research and information that's coming out is very interesting. And this whole issue of vaccination, whether to vaccinate or not, is evolving before our eyes.
There's a question here as well about whether or not the writing of a letter, after the direction, you had these 21 days to come out with what your policy was, or rather to tell your employees that you were going to institute a mandatory vaccination policy. Would it be good enough to simply address a letter to each employee regarding your decision to make it mandatory or not? Is that sufficient consultation? I'm not sure. Was there an obligation to consult?
I don't think there's an obligation to consult on your policy, but the policy it cannot state, for example, purely, we have decided that everyone in this department must be vaccinated. You would have to, in a policy, justify the manner in which you came to that conclusion and what you did in arriving at it. What considerations applied before you got there. A very large medical aid has recently published their justification for everyone to see, and that's a good example of what you would expect, where they tell everyone. They didn't, I'm sure they told their staff, but they told the whole world now why they arrived at the conclusion that they should have a mandatory vaccination policy.
Bronwyn or Donnie, maybe we'll ask Donnie this. How does an employer manage a religious or a cultural exemption from being vaccinated, or an objection rather? How would the employer manage one of these objections? What would be the process if you now come out with a mandatory vaccination policy, you tell your staff you require everyone to be vaccinated, and I come along and I either tell you, listen, on religious grounds, I'm objecting. How would you manage that? Or I tell you that, in fact, it's a cultural problem for me. How will you manage that process?
Well, firstly, Ira, everyone is jumping on the bandwagon that it's an infringement of constitutional rights, and those that you have mentioned are constitutional rights to a lesser or larger degree. The fact that you have the ability to opt out, I think, in itself puts paid to the constitutional challenge, because no one is forcing anything upon you. You make the election to be vaccinated or not. The real question really occurs after you've made your election, and that is, what's the consequences of it? Now, the direction tells us that you have to have a consultation with a person who refuses vaccination in order for you to make an assessment whether it's an unreasonable or a reasonable refusal. Now, it seems to me, if someone says, I will not be vaccinated because of my bodily integrity, that in a consultation you would be well within your rights to ask such an employee, have you ever had an injection? Have you ever had a drip put into you? And if the person says to you yes, then I don't think that can possibly constitute a reasonable objection. It may be that people are just scared of needles. Being scared of a needle cannot constitute a bodily integrity objection if you've had reluctantly been injected before. religious as well. You know, I think one would be able to interrogate, so what is this religion that precludes you from having a vaccine? And, you know, there are some religions that have those types of rules, but then you would probably be able to establish if this is a recently adopted religion or not, in order to try and avoid a vaccination. So it's that type of discussion that you would have to have in order to assess whether this is a true objection or whether it's just someone who tries to avoid being vaccinated. Because there's the difference in consequences. It would be far easier for you to terminate the services of someone whose objection is unreasonable, as against the true person who just feels completely strongly on either of those grounds, or even worse, where the person cannot be vaccinated because of some medical ground. A difficulty exists if that person is in a job that you cannot really give him reasonable accommodation. Then you're going to, in my view, probably have to terminate that person's services for incapacity.
And Donnie, would I be able to call for evidence? If you came along and said, well, you are now, you've got these religious objections and you belong to this particular religion, could I call for an interview with whoever's the head of your religious body and some kind of written documentation to support that you're a member of this community, that these are the beliefs, and then go and do my own analysis and investigation, I suppose?
Yeah, I would think so, because, you know, religion is something inherent in a person, and you can change your mind in a heartbeat. And my concern would be that people will claim religious objections because it's the easiest one to do, when it's really just them being afraid of needles, for instance. So the only way to interrogate that would be to say, well, please let me have your minister's name that I can give him a call, or show me some or other document that proves your affiliation or membership of that church, you know, and then you can maybe even go read up on that church to see if that is a doctrine that they adopt.
There's a question here which says, can you force employees to obtain a COVID test on a weekly basis before they can get access to the workplace?
It would have to be because of the inherent requirements of the job, and I suspect it would be an alternative to vaccination, because if people have been vaccinated, I don't think you can expect them to be tested. So it seems to me that can only really be something that would come up if you say to people, look, you don't want to be vaccinated, then I'm going to expect of you to produce me weekly a negative COVID test, because they only last, I think, a week or something like that. I don't see a difficulty with that, but it would require the circumstances to be that you have decided you want mandatory vaccination, and this is an exception to that rule.
Just it's quite expensive to go on a fortnightly basis for.
No, but that would have to be at the cost of the employer, I'm sure.
Well, I'm not sure. The employer has given. What if the employer says, I'll pay for your vaccination, and you say, no, I don't want to be vaccinated? Why should the employer have to pick up the cost for a weekly test if it already accommodates you with that indulgence to not being vaccinated by allowing you to just ensure that you remain negative? That would be, in my view, for the employee's cost.
That may be a little harsh, Donnie. A little hard to
That's my view.
Yes. You mentioned before this consideration of a reasonable accommodation, which I understand would include, for example, allowing employees to work off-site or at home if they can. Maybe those who don't want to be vaccinated, they can be accommodated by allowing them to continue to work at home or work in isolation. As you said, work outside of ordinary hours, or perhaps, wear particular PPEs. But in what circumstances then could I not be obliged to accommodate people? At what point is that you draw the line and say, listen, I can no longer accommodate you?
It would appear to me it's the efficiency of how work is done. It's the manner in which work is done. You can hardly accommodate a guy who works in a mine by saying work from home. You can also not accommodate someone on a production line. I doubt that you could accommodate someone who is public-facing, people who work with the public every day, to say you can work from home. If it's someone who comes into your store to buy something, and there must be someone who, a shop floor assistant, for instance. So those, I think it would be difficult to accommodate. But even in an environment such as ours, Ira, if you as the MD decides that people are not practicing efficiently from home because the output that you see is just not good enough, that should be grounds of its own to say people must come back to the office, and I want certain areas of the staff vaccinated.
Donnie, there's sorry.
Because fundamentally, it boils down to managerial prerogative as to how the business must run. Yes, the direction says you must accommodate people insofar as it is possible. So if people can show to you that they can work from home and they are very efficient and everything is great, then that would be an enormous argument against insisting that they be vaccinated to work from the office. But it may be that you want cohesion, camaraderie, all kinds of things that you now not have. And as the employer, you are entitled to set those rules.
It's also interesting, reasonable accommodation in the direction refers to the relevant portions of the Code of Good Practice, employment of people with disabilities, published in terms of the Employment Equity Act. And if you look at that, you don't have to reasonably find reasonable accommodation if it's going to cause undue hardship for the employer or the business. And
yes,
that would be unjustifiable hardships, action that results in a significant or considerable difficulty or expense. Also, it's also the case you don't have to create a vacancy for a person if there isn't one.
So what you're really saying is that if I've got, like we do over here, we've got a large number of offices and a great deal of space, and a lot of people can work remotely, but there are those who can't work remotely because they can't afford to do that. But if we could accommodate them by putting them in boardrooms or in offices where they're in isolation, and keep them outside of the general populace of the rest of our employees, that would be an accommodation that could work. We could say to them, you can come to work, please walk up the stairs, don't catch the lift, and please go and isolate in that room over there for the day. Do not interact with anybody else in the office. That would be an example of an accommodation.
Exactly. And it would be very difficult for them not to come to work.
Yes, it may be unpleasant, but I don't think they could object to that. There's a question over here, and that is, if in asking employees whether they have been vaccinated or not, can one ask them to produce their vaccine cards? Should you be asking them to produce their vaccine cards in order to verify the information that they provided to check that it's correct? Would that be okay? Can you do that?
That's coming to the whole notion of the vaccination passports.
Yes,
I don't think there's a problem, Ira, but what I will say to you is this: if someone should tell an untruth about vaccination, that would most definitely be dismissible.
And Donnie, how would you be able to determine if they've been vaccinated or not without asking them to please produce this certification? I'm giving you a day off. I may even be paying for the cost of the vaccination, not necessarily, but I'm telling you that as part of my program, you can go and have the day off, or even if I don't have a program, you can apply to go and get vaccinated. But surely I should be able to ask you for proof that you've been vaccinated if I've given you the day off at the least. And if I haven't, can I not, if I'm able to ask you whether you've been vaccinated or not, am I able then to ask you to provide proof?
I think you would be able to, because...
Sorry, Bronwyn?
Sorry, Donnie, carry on.
No, please.
No, I was saying that part of the direction is the employees, you must give employees paid time off to have the vaccination, provided they can provide you with proof that they're going to be vaccinated. And one of the things that you can insist on as proof is the vaccination card. So there would be absolutely no problem in asking for the vaccination card and receiving the proof. Otherwise, why would you give them a paid day off?
So there's a lot of talk.
We're losing sight. Sorry, we're losing sight. It's for the greater good of the whole of South Africa. We should all be working towards it and trying to help each other.
There's a lot of talk recently about various, if you want access to various areas, you're going to have to be vaccinated, you'll need a vaccination passport. Are restaurants going to tell you can only come to a restaurant if you're vaccinated? Maybe you can only go to the cinema if you're vaccinated. Even maybe at the end of the year, you'll only be allowed on the beach if you're vaccinated. That one I haven't heard yet, but it's potentially possible. Would we be able, Dani, for example, to turn around and say that the only people who can come and consult in our offices are people who've been vaccinated?
I think it would be foolish, Ira.
But would you, as an employer, be able to restrict access to your premises by inviting or allowing, only reserving the right of access to people who've been vaccinated?
I am aware of at least one company who is going to do it with fair warning quite soon, where you would have to be able to show that you are vaccinated before you enter their premises. Look, it's right of admission. It's right of admission reserved, so you can that type of rule. I cannot see that there's any difficulty in imposing it, but you would obviously have to tell people before they make the effort to come to your premises that, by the way, you can only enter upon production of your vaccination card.
There's a question here about whether it's possible. You know, we're talking about mandatory vaccination policies in relation to the employer-employee relationship. The question here is whether that can be extended to students or learners at educational institutions. I don't think the directive deals with that at the moment, does it, Bronwyn?
So I think that the directive is specific to the Health and Safety Act, and it does extend to people, not only employees, it's anybody who attends at your workplace. So it potentially could extend to learners and students.
So if I'm the head of a learning environment or institution, I could certainly impose a mandatory vaccination policy on the people who work there. But you're saying I could potentially also look to extend that to people who are attending the learning environment as well, like scholars.
Yes. I don't know what your view is, Danny.
There's a contractual relationship between an employer and an employee, and that would grant you the entitlement to impose vaccination policies on your employees. However, with the public at large or students, it would probably all come down to a right of admission reserve type argument, Ira. I'm aware of at least one university in the United States that has imposed a mandatory vaccination policy of anyone who comes upon the campus, and that has been upheld by the Supreme Court or the appeals court of that state. So yes, I cannot see why not, and I would suspect that a mandatory vaccination policy would be ideal for a university, because then university life would probably be able to continue slightly less impacted.
I think Dani's got it exactly right. So it won't be that they'll be forcing them or they won't be imposing them the policy, but you won't be allowed onto the campus unless you have it because of their policy.
Okay. Bronwyn, perhaps you can take us through the steps that have to be taken by an employer who wants to implement a mandatory vaccination policy? How do you go about doing this if you choose to do so?
Sure, no problem. This is obviously a brief, I'll take you through briefly what I see the steps as being. So you would then update your workplace plan, or if you haven't got a workplace plan in place already, you would have to prepare one and put in there whether you intend to make mandatory workplace policy mandatory. List the categories of employees that must be vaccinated and when the vaccinations will become available. So that's where you would identify particular categories of people in the workplace. Provide electronic support for employees to join on the government website or register on the government website. Allow employees the right to refuse the vaccine. So they must know that they can refuse to take the vaccine on the various grounds which we've discussed, constitutional, medical, or religious grounds. Provide employees with information and training on the benefits of COVID-19 and the vaccination. Where it's reasonable and practically possible to provide transport to the vaccination sites, and allow employees sick leave and or paid time off should they suffer any adverse effects as a result of having the vaccination. If they've obviously exhausted their sick leave, then that's a different story, and you may have to assist them with a claim to the Compensation for Occupational Injury and Diseases Act.
Okay, thank you, Bronwyn. Can you perhaps, Bronwyn, also give us a little bit of insight regarding the link between the Occupational Health and Safety Act and mandatory vaccination policies? What are the employer's obligations in terms of OSHA in regard to this?
So an employer has a duty to do what is reasonably practical to ensure that the working environment is safe for all employees and those who access their workplace. So that's basically the link between a mandatory vaccination policy and the Occupational Health and Safety Act. You would, like we've said on various occasions, the duty to impose a compulsory vaccination policy would be determined after having done the risk assessment and also having regard to various factors. For example, the availability of the vaccine, objections by employees, the safety of the vaccine, and the effectiveness of other measures that you may want to implement, which are less stringent than implementing a compulsory vaccination policy. An employer also is required to consult with the Health and Safety Committee in terms of the Occupational Health and Safety Act in relation to the implementation of the mandatory vaccination policy, and to make the risk assessment plan and workplace plan available for inspection by the Health and Safety Committee, trade union, and also there's inspectors that have been appointed in terms of these directions.
Ira, in respect of the Occupational Health and Safety Act, it must also be pointed out that there's also a reciprocal obligation on employees to ensure their own safety as well as those of their co-workers. So even though it's the primary responsibility of the employer, it's also the responsibility of the employees. And in that, for me, lies the obligation to seriously consider mandatory vaccination. If there is some kind of challenge on a constitutional basis on those rights that we have talked about earlier, you will also find that sections 36 of the Constitution indicates that all human rights can be limited by laws of general application. Now, the OSH Act is the fundamental law of general application, which would entitle you to possibly infringe on the human rights by virtue of a mandatory vaccination policy.
So what does that mean in plain terms, Donnie?
I thought I made it expressly clear, Ira.
What is that?
It means that if someone raises a challenge that you have infringed these constitutional rights to religion or bodily integrity, that the defense to that would be the employer has the obligation to create a safe workplace, and by complying with that obligation, it decided on a mandatory vaccination policy which entitles it to infringe upon those constitutional rights in terms of Section 36 of the Constitution.
Okay. So it's not going to be so easy for the employee to raise that as an objection in light of that argument.
Yes, it would be, everyone sees the human rights as being absolutely supreme, but they are equally subject to the limitation clause in the Constitution if a law of general application can be utilized to limit them. And there are various grounds that you would have to further go to say why the limitation would be justified in an open and democratic society. But the greater good of society in this instance, I would suspect, would trump the law, the individual human rights.
Bronwyn, you want to?
It's important to also note that the direction states that the workers, there's an obligation on workers to comply with measures imposed by the employer in terms of the direction.
There's a question here. Somebody asks that if they are vaccinated and they have comorbidities, and not everybody in the company is vaccinated, would they be within their rights to refuse to go back to work and to continue to work from home?
I think it gets back to that question we had earlier, and that is you would have to make the assessment of the risk involved in such a vaccinated person with comorbidities. And if it is impossible to justify a mandatory program because of that, then you would have to look into reasonable accommodation for that vaccinated employee with comorbidities. I don't think you will ever be able to terminate that employee's services because other people refuse to be vaccinated, though. That I don't think will fly.
And I suppose that's part of the accommodation. If I do have comorbidities, even if I am vaccinated and not everybody else is vaccinated, and if I can work remotely and fulfill the functions for which you've employed me, then you should accommodate me and allow me to work from home if it meets your operational requirements.
Yes.
Can one differentiate, this is another question, regarding sick leave between those who are vaccinated and those who are not vaccinated?
Look, there's statutory obligations in regard to sick leave. If people have exhausted their sick leave, I would suggest that you would probably be able to discriminate between providing further sick leave to people who have vaccinated and not to those who have not.
Okay. So, in conclusion then, do you think that, how would you recommend that employers, what would you say to an employer in conclusion about how they go about deciding what to do or what not to do? It's quite a difficult task. It's quite a difficult decision to decide whether you're going to implement a mandatory policy or not. I've heard around the office, for example, certain people who've had COVID saying they would hate to be vaccinated again. They suffered so badly with COVID. There are also guys who've come out, there are apparently some studies from Israel which indicate that your immunity, if you've had COVID, lasts that much longer than your immunity if you've just been vaccinated. It lasts longer. And various people have got a whole lot of grounds for objecting. I hate to force people to do things that they don't want to do, Dani. But what advice would you give to an employer faced with this crisis now? Because they've all got to make this kind of decision.
Ira, there's not been any case law that I'm aware of where this has been tested properly through the courts. I know of a few threatened urgent applications on this. It seems to me that an employer would have to carefully assess his own position. It can never be just a knee-jerk reaction to something. There would have to be justification and a measured approach. And for that, it appears to me that a policy ought to be compiled, drafted, put in place that everyone knows where they stand with their employer, and the employer has something to fall back on if he's ever challenged, to at least have some indication of the reasonableness of his conduct, and that it was known to everyone because the policy was there for all to see. So it seems to me that we will face litigation. There's little question of that. And I think there will be topics that we have not even guessed could come up yet. But I think if an employer has gone to the trouble of assessing his own position and adopting a policy, and that doesn't have to be cast in stone and be for all time, it would be a fluid document that can be changed as circumstances change. We may find that they come up with something that's better than the current vaccines or something else, who knows. But at least there would be a fallback for the employer to be able to justify his conduct.
Thank you, guys. We're out of time. Can't take any more questions. Thank you so much, Bronwyn. Thank you, Dani. Thank you for the Mail and Guardian for having us this morning. And guys, if you need anything further or you need any legal advice, please don't hesitate to contact us.
Thank you.
Thank you.